Hey everybody, Professor Snart just checking in again here. Okay, so we are into basically day 2, but it feels like we're midterm, to me at least, in terms of our course here, and I am just going to click myself into it. So just a reminder about due dates coming up. Then we have the first 2 units, the introductions and the creation myths unit, both due Friday, June 1st. So hopefully you've done most of the introductions, pardon me, the introductions part. Mostly, that's fairly straightforward as far as using the discussion board and then building your home page. A couple of reminders then, especially as far as grading goes. Obviously, I'm not grading you on the content per se, although it doesn't look great if you just cut and paste this exact same text from both places. It's kind of just... Anyway, what really matters is you're following directions. So this is a good example where I'm not really grading the content, right? And certainly not grammar and mechanics and really basic stuff like that, since it's so informal, but have you follow directions. So for the discussion board, have you made sure to respond to other students? Pretty simple. And then for the student homepage, have you made sure to include a picture of yourself? Because again, like I said in the earlier announcement, really the point of those is to get a sense for the actual people that are in our class. So we need a reasonable picture of you. Make sure that it's resized so it fits in there. It's not this humongous thing that gets all squirrely. Every computer would come with free image editing software, so you don't need to fancy Photoshop the thing. It's just a matter of literally resizing it. And often the resize in terms of how it looks on the screen will also help with the file size itself, which can sometimes affect Blackboard in terms of whether it will let you embed the picture right in your home page, which is what you need so we can see it, rather than attaching it as a file, because that's not what you want. So again, just following those kinds of basic directions and you get full points for that first part of Unit 1, just the introductions part. The other piece for Unit 1, I'm just going to click myself back into it here, is really just some basic early groundwork, framework kinds of readings here. There's reading from the textbook, again really taking us back to the invention of writing, which is fundamentally the invention of literature, a word that derives from the same root that gives us like letters. So the idea of an oral literature is actually kind of a contradiction in terms until it becomes written in a strictly, etymological sense by just the definition of it. Unless it's written, it's really not literature. And that, I don't want you to twist that or take it the wrong way. It doesn't mean that oral cultures don't have sophisticated stories or traditions or anything like that. But really for us, we're interested in kind of the moment when those oral traditions become fixed in some form and become literature, become actually written down. Although, of course, as you'll discover, what we think of as writing today really evolved out of this amazingly complex and really interesting, I guess you can call it conversation or cultural sharing among so many different societies and writing traditions, so that there's not just one single kind of writing that developed with the ancient Sumerians, for example, and somehow traces its history in this really linear fashion, like then it became this, then it became that, then it became this, and now we have it today in its perfect form. It just didn't work like that. There's lots of traditions, for example, Asian traditions that started completely separate from those earliest Sumerian traditions, or conventions, or even the basic, like, how do we do this? How do you write something? The most ancient writing we have is simply wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay, slightly wet clay tablets that would then harden and dry. You can imagine how fragile that would be, and yet they or things like them have been preserved through thousands of years. It's pretty amazing to think of that they survived 10 years, let alone 100, let alone 1,000, but they did. But those various writing traditions then would develop and kind of intermingle with other cultural traditions, and often what we think of as then it got better, then it got better, then it got better. There's a lot of cases where it got better, it got more sophisticated, it disappeared entirely, it was reinvented, like kind of amazing stuff like that. So the history of writing, which is kind of where our course begins before you even read anything about what was written, that whole history of writing is pretty fascinating. In addition to that, then there's a reading assignment or some readings built into our course here that again just lay out some of the really, really broad ideas we want to keep in mind as we move through. So the notion of a liberal education, certainly something like masterpieces, and our course, Masterpieces of World Literature. It sounds pretty fancy, but I mean, how do you even begin that, right? What is a masterpiece? What defines that? Who gets to decide? If you achieve masterpiece status, do you always get that, or do we have to reevaluate these things? How do we add new things to that canon, or is a masterpiece only something that is old, which sounds like a cliche or kind of corny, but if a masterpiece is only something that's proven its worth time and time again, then how can you have a modern masterpiece, right? Well, we can guess that it's going to prove itself, but do we really know? So even a simple term like that kind of invites all of these interesting questions. And then world, you know, where do you even start? For the longest time, because writing is centered in these relatively small kind of social gatherings, world literature is really just a few places. But the more complex that becomes, we begin to talk about different literary traditions, but then you get this sort of talking back and forth between those traditions. So even place doesn't matter exactly. Like with the expansion of the Roman Empire, all of a sudden you have places that are writing or producing art generally in the Roman tradition, but they're geographically, almost literally all over the map. And then of course as time goes on and we get towards a more contemporary time period, the notion of world becomes even more complicated because of all of those cross-cultural traditions, and how or do we even try to separate out one specific tradition. So we talk about literature of South America or of Africa. And Africa and South America, but particularly Africa is a good example where you might have a native tradition, but that continent and so many of its countries, as they've existed and been reformulated either from within or more often from without, how do all those traditions equate to like a native quote-unquote tradition, one that developed in a place without any outside influence? It's almost impossible to find that. So the notion of world literature is almost redundant in the sense that at some point the world is everywhere and everywhere is the world. Ooh, that just blew my mind. So I know that's a little early for where we're at in the course, but okay. If you have to rewind and listen, anyway. A couple of other things in the readings here that you can look at. But then we get into our first kind of content unit, which is Unit 2, Creation Myths, really looking at kind of a comparative mythology. And so it's important, specifically for this kind of stuff, to put aside our own particular religious or spiritual beliefs and just read the work here as text, as historical documents that existed at a particular time period and reflected the culture out of which they emerged. And part of what we're looking for is really the ways in which these creation myths, the telling of really the beginning of everything, how it navigates the relationship between the human and the divine, and ultimately how things come to be. You'll notice some really interesting connections between all of them, but also some interesting differences as well. So we can sort of do a compare-contrast as far as these various early stories of how the world began. And then our first really sort of a formal discussion board assignment here where you're writing the discussion board essay. You may want to refamiliarize yourself then with those discussion board essay requirements so you make sure you're getting everything done correctly. One of the most important things, and this really goes to something I'd said in the earlier video, is that when you're doing these, you want to keep in mind that what you're trying to show me is not that you get everything about world literature ever, right? Or that you have some profound insight about the Hebrew Bible that nobody has ever thought of before, but just that you're engaging with the material in the course. So one of the most obvious things to do is to make sure you include direct quotation from those texts that you're writing about. This shows me that you've read at least that much and hopefully the entirety of the thing. So again, your analysis sort of plays into, does it show me that you've read, but also read within context, so that you can make those kind of comparisons or contrasts that we're going for. You'll see that there's a number of options here to choose from. Obviously, you're just choosing one, not trying to tackle all of them in just a couple pages here. And make sure, last but not least, that you're completing the assignment by responding to a couple of other student posts as well. A thoughtful paragraph, probably a little less formal than your own post itself. Maybe you had similar ideas, maybe someone states something in a way that you hadn't thought of before. You can disagree if you want, but again, that gets a little tricky. Often you want to frame that kind of thing as someone put something a certain way that you necessarily hadn't thought of and that you had this other way of thinking about it. So instead of a yes, no, or right, wrong, we develop kind of multiple yeses, multiple correct ways of seeing things, or possibly correct. Not that you agree with it necessarily, but that it's a valid interpretation based on textual evidence. And that again is why you want to develop your argument or your writing with lots of quotation, right? So that you can present a point of view, and it's not just your opinion, it's your analysis interpretation based on the facts, the text that we have at hand. Okay, so be sure to keep up with that work, keep on top of those due dates because they really come fast as we move through the course. And if you have questions or concerns or anything going on, be in touch with me sooner rather than later, since again we move so quickly through all of this.